in here.
Very cold.
It's so cold in here. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miriam, and I'm going to present our next speaker for the session, How to Welcome and Include Children with Autism and Other Special Needs in the Church, a universal call to meaningful and prepare and include all God's children. And our presenter will be Dr. Lawrence R. Sutton. Dr. Lawrence is an ordained deacon and a psychologist specializing in autism. He is the former director of the Western Pennsylvania Office of Autism Services and is currently the director of the pre-theology program at St. Vincent College. As a deacon, he developed and has run a sacramental preparation and religious education program for children, adolescents touched by autism in the Diocese of Pittsburgh since 2003 at Our Lady of Grace Catholic Church. His primary work over the past 18 years has been with children and adults touched by autism and worked with those with other types of disabilities throughout his career. He is nationally recognized for developing his own methodology for providing religious education to children with special needs. His latest book was released by Lambing Press in fall 2022, Autism and Holy Orders: How to Help Seminarians with Autism Become Effective Priests. He received the gold medal in the Illumination Book Awards for his recent book, published by Loyola Press, Teaching Students with Autism in a Catholic Setting. Dr. Lawrence has also worked with criminal justice-related issues since the 1980s, initially with alcohol and drug-related problems, particularly with alcohol, drug-impaired driving, and then later with individuals who had either a developmental or psychiatric disorder. He worked in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's Bureau of Juvenile Justice Services as manager of psychological services from 2004 to 2007. Let us welcome Dr. Lawrence Sutton.
I think Miriam said too much. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's not too far away from home for a change, which is very good. I'm a psychologist and a deacon, which is unusual in my diocese and the diocese I work in, because I work with seminarians at the major seminary at St. Vincent Seminary and College. I hope you find this a bit interesting. That's a little bit different. I have a tendency, as I told Miriam, that I perseverate. I get off on stories, and I have a wonderful PowerPoint presentation that I hope you'll find interesting. You may get to see a little bit of it, because I'll get off on the things. If you have questions, somehow let me know. If you and anybody can't hear me in the back or wherever, let me know, because I have a tendency, I like to walk, and I can't walk, so I'm going to be bouncing around. It drives my wife crazy when I do this. So, if you see a candle flickering and you don't have the words to express your happiness, or you hear a bird that's chirping and singing and you like it, if you're really happy but you don't have words to express yourself, what do? You stim. Do you know what stimming is? Stimming can sometimes be bouncing on your toes. Sometimes it can be flapping your hands. Sometimes it can be tapping. You know, as a deacon, so I'm already doing it. As a deacon, I have the opportunity of speaking from the ambo. And sometimes my sermons, they're okay. Sometimes you could hear a pin drop. And when I know it's that silent in the congregation, I know I have people. I know that I'm right on in that particular time, and it's really good. Sometimes I'm not so good. There was one little boy, Sean, he would get up and he'd walk back and forth in front of the altar. Well, Sean has a lot of energy, so I don't worry about Sean. Henry, however, in the back of the room, Henry, he would get up and he'd start bouncing and he would start flapping this way. And it was at that point that I realized that he's really expressing what everybody else is thinking. He better shut up and get on with it. And he was generally right. If you know what to look for, you know what to listen for, children with autism, children with other type of developmental disabilities can tell you a great deal. And one needs to listen and pay attention to it if you're willing to look and to listen. Many of the people that I teach during the week don't always listen that way, but they'll learn, my seminarians. What does Pope Francis ask us to do? He's asked us to speak up for those that can't really speak for themselves, to speak for those who are destitute, to judge fairly, to defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Most importantly, we're to be present, be alive, ask questions, and never accept the ordinary. Live your faith in what you do each day. As a church, we need to understand and recognize the gifts of all of its members, and we need to overtly and meaningfully prepare people in whatever way that they have. What I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is almost like an evangelization of the family. You know, coming and doing a catechetical program of sorts when I was trained as a psychologist, when I swore when I got ordained that I wasn't going to do anything related to my field, and then of course the Holy Spirit jumps in and tells you what you're really going to do, things change. I do things differently, and so the program I'm going to talk about is a program that is very effective. There are a lot of good effective programs. This is just one method. I'm not saying it's the best by any means, but it's been around for a while and it's been working fairly well. But as a parent, it just seems so overwhelming. I can't seem to get Father on his own. I think he's avoiding me. Mr. Don, the Director of Religious Education, seems so busy. And it's just one person. Isn't my child special? He doesn't really need to be prepared, does he? Every child is a person of God, a child of God. We each have our own gifts and talents. Wouldn't God want us to help each person, those with and without a disability? I hope to challenge you today, perhaps to inspire, and I'm showing you things or hoping to show you some things that can be done. You know, I receive calls a great deal, even one this semester that we're working in, from parents who struggle with somehow their child's not being able to receive the Eucharist or one of the sacraments. I challenge my seminarians to say, is our job to help people avoid sacraments or to prepare them for sacraments and to administer the sacraments? The calls that I get sometimes are about, I can't tell if my child's ready, and the priest says he doesn't understand him, or he's not ready. What does it take? For example, for confirmation, what does it take to get confirmed? What are the basic minimum requirements of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops to be confirmed? You're all catechists, you all teach this. You have to be baptized as one, and there's only one other requirement. You have to want it. Yes, you want to do everything else you can to prepare them, unless, of course, you're from the Diocese of New Orleans, because they won't confirm you until you're in high school, and you have to pass a comprehensive test. So how in the world could a child or individual with a disability ever be prepared for it? I pick on them because I've been there a number of times presenting and question why that's necessary, especially when the U.S. bishops tell us a little bit different. So, but is there hope in general? My program is centered a lot around what Stephen spoke about this morning. It's one-on-one catechesis, and it's a little bit different. How can a single person impact the life of a child with a disability, or a family with a disability, or even a parish who has disabled members? I know Sister said it at one point, some dioceses that I've been invited to, there was one in Florida I was supposed to speak at last June, until the bishop came in and said, we don't have anybody with disabilities in this diocese, so do you really want to bring that person here for this? And I kind of just shook my head, and the director of their special needs ministry did basically the same thing, and I didn't get to go, of course. It's got to change. So how can an individual make this type of change, particularly if that individual happens to be an adolescent? Aren't they unremarkable? Don't you really hold your breath by the time they get to 11 or 12 and don't let it out until they're, 30? Is that about the end of adolescence? Well, a teen can change your own. This particular parable, imagine, if you will, in the center of the room is Jesus and his friends, the friends of this person with a disability that you can see here being lowered in, cut a hole in our roof. That's hard when you're in the basement here, but imagine these 4 friends of them dropping their friend in to sit and to get close to Jesus. Autism has many different faces, and this is one of the stories that I'll tell in this particular segment and not in the one later on this afternoon. It's about 2 different boys. Michael was a boy. In my state, you can evaluate a child. If you find that they have a definable disability, you can prescribe, psychologists can prescribe services that can go in the home, in the school, in the community. Well, Michael's one of these kids that I knew from a very young age. He was 4 when I first met him. He was nonverbal, didn't say a word at all. He didn't really get his language till close to 9 years of age. Well, all through this time, every time they would come in, and in order to get these services, you'd have to come to see a psychologist either 2 or 3 times per year. His dad knew that this program was going on, but he said, no, that's okay. We're fine. He's really at trouble at times, so we don't want him to go to church. Okay. But I would ask him every time anyhow. Come 14 years of age, his dad finally said, I give up. You've asked me about it all the time. All right, I'll come to your class. Well, my class uses neurotypical teenagers, typical teens. They don't have any type of a disability. They want to get sometimes community service. Sometimes their parent says you have to do this. Usually it's they want to learn a little bit about it. Well, one of my teen mentors was a ninth grade peanut. Beth had to be maybe 90 pounds. She was what, this big. And Michael was a great big boy. At that point, he was 240 pounds. He was a great big kid. He had just started talking at 9. He's 14 now, so he's got a little bit of language. When he sees me, he'll say a word or two because he knows I'm going to ask him all kinds of questions, so he doesn't really want to be around me. He saw Beth, cute little 9th grade girl. And Beth went up to him, and Dad and I are on the side talking. She says to him, Michael, I know that you haven't received First Communion yet or reconciliation. He says, do you mean confession? She says, yeah. Do you mean like Cain and Abel? And she said, yeah. Well, at that point, my jaw opened, Dad's jaw opened. And didn't he tell this pretty little girl the whole story of Cain and Abel and the need for confession? And I just said, where in the world did this come from? This is a kid that when he went to school, his parents insisted he was in mainstream education. And if you talk too fast, you'd hear him yell out. It was really funny in my classes because we'd always say the Hail Mary before we break into classes, and I'll explain the program in a second. He would yell out from the back, slow it down. It's hard to say this Hail Mary slower than I was trying to say it, but that's what we were doing. But in school, you can't do that in a typical school. And so at some point you'd hear this great big bang. Sorry, I hope I didn't break my hand. But it wasn't from his hand, it was from his head. He'd be so frustrated, he would get so upset. And here's this boy now at 14 with his young mentor performing and saying fluid sentences all about it. Was it because she was an attractive young girl that people like that never talked to him? That's probably part of it. Or is it because of the whole setup where he was? Now, the sad thing about his particular story, one of the sad things, was his dad didn't realize that he could stay in the program as long as he wanted. So he was ready to receive communion after a year and a half. We got him ready. But then by the time it came for confirmation, and as you know, I just told you what the requirements were as I interpret them for confirmation, Dad said, no, we're not ready. We're not ready. He waited all the way until he was like 21. And, I kind of didn't get it, and then I got it. Dad said to me, he said, this is his social group. We meet early Sunday mornings. He lived very far away from where my church was that we were doing this, but he would be the first one up in the morning, waking his dad up, getting them ready so he could make the long drive, no matter what the weather was. It was driving Dad crazy because it was much earlier than they needed to get up, but that was his place to be. It turned out that that's where he wanted to be. And Dad said, I didn't want to stop his group because this is so important to Michael to be at. All right, take that story, and now think about Greg. Greg was a kid that, and I'll do it fast because I get in these stories, and when he was evaluated by a school psychologist, he had a measured IQ of 84. That's in the mild range of an intellectual disability. He had good language at that point for a 5-year-old. And the school said would like to put him in a life skills program because of his IQ. And the parents said, no, that's okay, let's just keep him in regular education. Well, that was good for him because he was no problem at all, and he was kind of invisible. Nothing glaring that was there. At age 17, because of Social Security disability, which occurs at 18, where a person can independently get it, they reevaluated him, found his IQ had jumped up a little bit to the low 70s. 70s typically the cutoff for that. He still qualified for it. Everybody was happy with it, and he continued high school until he was 21, the time when secondary education has to end. At 21, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation approached him and said, well, Greg, you have very good language. You might like to do some type of work of some sort. And so they reevaluated him a third time, a third IQ test, 3 different tests, but they were all considered valid. He came out with a full scale of 94. Now that's 2 standard deviations higher. How is that possible? I do in-services to school psychologists all the time, and I throw these dilemmas because you see, with autism, you don't know what they know. It's really very confusing. It's very hard to understand because you're given a lecture and they're looking out the window, or they're doing this, or they're fumbling, or they're doing whatever, and you ask them a question. Oftentimes they give you spot on. They can't respond to you very quickly. Well, in Greg's particular case, you see, you can't get high scores by accident. You might hear that little fan buzzing in the background here. That could drive some kids crazy with that because they'll focus on it and they can't concentrate. Or they may have had a fight on the way to get to the testing session, or they may not have slept the night before because they were nervous about it or something. So you can get low scores for all kinds of reasons, but you can't get high scores by accident. My thought was, if you think about processing of information, you take information in, you process it to understand it, then you come out with a response. When he was little, it took him a long time to do this type of processing. As he got older, his processing became more efficient, so it more closely reflected what he actually knew. As a psychologist, I knew that we didn't have instruments that were capable of looking at his actual abilities at that point in time. So my point to the school psychologist, my point to my faculty that I work with at St. Vincent College, working with these seminarians who are autistic, is that you need to understand what they know and what they don't, and how they learn, and how you present information, and where they get stuck. I have a seminarian, drove everyone crazy. He had all kinds of energy. He would get mad. His temper was horrible. Eventually got to the point that these walls looked fairly thick, and I had an office in the basement. I said, no one's going to hear you down here, so if you need to scream and yell in my room. And he thought I was weird, but he certainly did it. He was one that would punch his hand through things until his hand got hurt. Well, I taught him, I says, that's probably not the safest or the healthiest thing, particularly if you're a junior monk, because they're not going to keep you if you keep doing things like this. He agreed. So they ended up with a nice area field next to their fire pit that didn't have any chopped wood. In 3 years, they had something that was so large and high because every time he got mad, he would chop wood. He didn't buy my arguments until one day I said, I'm going to be gone for the weekend. It's a long weekend. And there was a lot of snow. Up in Latrobe, there's a lot of snow, usually. So the issue with him was when he got mad, I said, if you get mad, I'm not here, I want you to go out in the snow and wash your face with it. Well, he thought I was really, again, strange. I came back on Monday. He gave me the biggest, strongest bear hug, nearly broke the ribs, because it worked. And from that point forward, almost anything I would say he would do, which is a scary thing, But he followed it and he understood it. He needed to somehow get that anger out so he could do things. You know, it turns out that he's the best homilist that I've ever heard coming through the seminary in the 10 years that I've been there, which is curious. But if you ask him to do a research paper and you're really vague with how to start it, he'll go crazy. He'll start punching things. He'll start swearing. This is when he was in graduate school. So I basically made a deal with his instructors that you have to help him get started. Once you get him started, he'll produce a magnificent presentation, but he's not able to get things started on his own. It's an executive functioning type of a problem that people with autism typically have, if that makes any sense. So my point with these two gentlemen of talking about them, I think there's lots of Michaels and Gregs around, and it's really hard to know what to do. Maybe you remember the wedding at Cana, where Jesus came to bless the couple when he was there, or it was the beginning of his ministry. His mother came to him and said, you know, you've got to help these people. Well, what if that, after he blessed the child, that couple first had children, and what if that couple's child was disabled? Say he or she was autistic. What did Jesus say? Jesus said, let all the children come to me. Do not hinder them. They're all part of his world. Shortly after my dissertation, Shortly after my ordination, I decided to write. We were the first class in 25 years, only the second class in my diocese to have been ordained, so most people didn't know what a deacon was. So I thought it was good to illustrate what some deacons can do, and we had a couple of lawyers, a couple of physicians. I was the only psychologist, but most of us had professional degrees of some sort. And I would write articles in our local newspaper, local Pittsburgh Catholic newspaper. Anything that happened to do with anything with a child with autism anywhere in the country, families of the children that I worked with knew about it. There was this one child hit the newspapers. It was in the upper Midwest, where the Christian church, wasn't a Catholic church, decided that they wanted to remove the evil spirits from this child because he had autism. So they laid him down, they all prayed over him, putting their hands on him, and they pushed so hard that the boy suffocated. And it just, every one of my parents knew about it because it was going on. And so I get some parents that will come into me and say, what are you trying to do with my child? Because they really have fears about what people might think or say because their child can't communicate so well, or they do odd types of behaviors or whatever. So in fact, I had one dad come up to me with a story. He said, you know, I got really mad at the ushers one day. My kids, the child that I first worked with was there. He was pretty active. His little brother was all over the place. But Dad brought them to church. And the usher hit him on the shoulder at one point in Mass, said, don't you know we have these cry rooms back here for your kids? We got really mad, and he just left. He was gone for almost 2 months. Came back, kids were there. He made eye contact with the pastor who was on the altar. The pastor came up to him after Mass, and he was going to say why he had been gone for a while. Pastor said, I haven't seen you for a while. He's starting to tell him, I know because I didn't notice your envelopes in the basket. And he just lost it again. He thought, all you want is my money. You're not going to be here for my kids. So he said to me after, I guess it was 6 months of the class, he said, I was checking you out. I don't know if you knew you were on trial, but I wanted to see what you were going to do with my kids. His child was one of the most interesting of the boys that I've worked with. He's just he's a second grader. He was one of the first ones. And I had a boy that his mother made him come. He says, your brother has Asperger's. That technically doesn't exist anymore. It's a high-functioning form of autism. He says, I want you to be one of these teen mentors, and I don't think you have any choice of it. It's like he had his arm behind his back. So he came in, he was very reluctant. And I put him with this boy that was pretty active. So he wasn't so happy, but they were drawing pictures at the end of the class one day. Little boy came in the next week, and he said, I drew a picture of you. And so Dan went and looked at the picture. There's Dan, there's the little boy, and there's his dog. And he says, I changed the name of my dog's name to Dan. And the mentor just started crying, the boy. He was one of the best mentors that I've ever had in terms of, why would you use a teenager, by the way? Any ideas? Teenagers, what are they good for? They model typical behavior. They don't often dress very good. Sometimes they go out Saturday night before the early Sunday morning class, so their eyes are down to here. But my kids were listening to them. They watched and they listened to everything that they did. It was rather an amazing thing because I would do them one-to-one, a teenager, with one of these. I would provide them improved curriculum. And in my curriculum that I gave to them, and I'll ask Father Garcia if he can include the PowerPoint, because I know I'm not going to get through most of it, so you can see the rest of it. But what I would ask them to do is to take part of the lesson for each week and just do one aspect of it. I don't care how long it takes, and some kids needed to take 2 to 3 weeks, 2 to 3 sessions before they would get it through. Sometimes you could, a child that was very bright and high functioning could go right through them. And I said, no, I don't want that. We're doing this whole group type of process because it was a community. Because not only did I have the children there and their mentors, but I had their parents as well. Because I required one parent to be there, not for behavior issues, but I had them there to see that a typical teen would be teaching your child meaningful religion. Now, you might think all kinds of things with a teen. Guess the thing that they were scared about the most? Giving a homework assignment to the parent. They were scared of the parents. They were great with the kids. I always knew when things were working well. I would go into a classroom, and we had quite a few kids at one point, and I'd step in, the conversation would stop. And they'd answer my question or two. I'd leave, and they would carry on with just what they were talking about before in the lesson. I was in the way at that point. So they were doing a lesson, and they were successfully communicating it. What happened with those teenagers? What was going on with them, these 9th, 10th, 12th grade students, as they were going through? They were being recatechized because they were learning those lessons so specifically because they knew how their child learned, they knew what was good for them, and how they could convey it, and so they had to learn it inside and out. And they were bringing materials, they were getting ready for it, and they were presenting it. Even the children without language, or very little language, we eventually had success with them. This is how I kind of got started. In 2003, well, actually a little bit before then, I was ordained in 1999, and I discovered in the parish that I was assigned to, a child wasn't allowed to receive the Eucharist in May, which is when we typically give them. He had worked all year long to that point, but they said, no, you can't. My neighboring parish, which happened to be my original home parish, also had one child who did the same thing, that they didn't let him receive. I didn't find out until June of that year. I met a wonderful woman, Grace Harding. If some of you may know her. Grace worked with Eunice Shriver, President Kennedy's sister, on the creation of the Rose Kennedy curriculum. And Grace basically said, she handed me a copy of this very large curriculum, and she essentially said goodbye and good luck because she retired in July. So I waited basically for a first year trying to think about how to organize a program, but my diocese didn't do anything. They still didn't replace Grace after she had retired. So I took the Rose Kennedy curriculum and I started to adapt it. And I would still write these articles in the Pittsburgh paper, and I would get people would send me emails, and eventually it got to the point that I had friends in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. that said, you know, you really ought to take that curriculum someplace. And so I approached Loyola Press, and finally they let me come to see them. And I can still remember the operating manager said, you know, we had 3 presentations today. I was the first one, so I'm not going to be able to stay very long. So I started talking about my program. I started talking about the examples of it. And by the end of the day, I don't know what happened to the other 2 presentations because she brought lunch in, and then we were talking about dinner because she never left with her team. She says, you know, your program really needs to be put together. And she said, what I'd like you to do is by Christmas, this is in July, I'd like you to write a book about it. Well, I'd never written a book in my life, and you know, anybody that sees me up close that way, when my eyes start really fluttering like that, it's because I'm extraordinarily nervous. And I said, of course I'll do that. Fortunately, they had very, very good editors, which helped me along. But they said, you know, in all honesty, you really don't know how to write curriculum. So all that adaptations. What they ended up doing was adapting one of their current curriculums, which was Finding God. They call it Adapted Finding God. And they used all of our methods to break down each lesson like 6 different ways. So you could do it in a typical classroom, or you could do it one-to-one. So it's still complicated to figure out how to do that, but it works very well. But it was because of these 2 children who were turned away. I still don't understand why that is the case. Both of them moved out of the area, so I wasn't able to follow them. Do you know, children with autism, it's 1 in 44 is what the CDC basically says right now. Typically with these programs, I'm going to talk really fast now, I do a brief description of what autism is and what it's not, because I found that everybody has their own understanding of what autism is, and I think it's better just to say it's a developmental disorder. So whether or not the parent recognized it or not, that disorder, those symptoms had to be present by the time they were 5 or 6 years of age, during that developmental time frame. You know that manual they give you when you get married? They tell you about what to do with kids, what to do with your partner, how to live life together with a person. Yeah, I don't know if you have them here. We don't have them where I was at either. We should have them. But you know, the firstborns, who knows, you know, what's normal, what's not normal. So if a child's not talking by the time they're 1 year of age, or 2 years of age, you know, they may know by 2 that maybe there's a delay. They don't know that the flapping's not unusual, or watching the fan spin, or things like that. All those are typical behaviors for a toddler. When you put them all together, then you have a bit of an issue. For sake of brevity for this today's talk, it's broken down in a couple of areas. The first is language and communication. Did the child talk by the time they were 12 months of age, give or take a couple of months? Did they talk in small phrases or sentences by 18 months of age, give or take a couple of months? Sometimes children do talk a lot, but when you ask a question to them, they give you gibberish. They give you words that don't make any sense at all, so they don't really understand the language. So is communication impaired for a child of that age? Social play. Do they know how to play? You know, sometimes, and I'm going to walk away from the camera for a second, so just so you're prepared for that. You know, you 2 look like you are really fun to play with. So I want to play with you. I don't know how to. I'm just going to stand here and hover. And, are you nervous? I like your hair. I might have to start cutting your hair. They don't know the rules of social play. They don't understand, sorry, thank you, I cut you both off guard. You know, in other places when I know the people, oh, actually, never mind. But they don't know it. Or sometimes they'll get a group of kids to play, usually younger kids, to play with them, but you play by my rules. Because when I play by my rules, I'm not going to lose. But all the little kids will do it until they realize this isn't much fun because I never win, or they wander away. So I look for these types of behaviors. I also look about repetitive behaviors, which is the third area. Typically I'll ask, do they play with toy cars or trains? Oh yeah. Do they ever line them up? You know, they line them up by size, by color, by model, various types of things. And if somebody like a big brother or sister or somebody else moves one, do they get upset? They talk about the tantrums that they might throw. Do they ever turn the wheels upside down and spin them because they like to watch things that spin? What other type of repetitive behaviors? Open and close doors, turn light switches on and off. Again, these behaviors aren't unique to children with autism, but they're behaviors that are, if you take a bunch of them together, are typical. Now, for a diagnosis like autism. So if one has, in the developmental time frame, preponderant symptoms in these 3 core areas of issues, then you can make a diagnosis of autism there. If a parent really has very good information and gives it to you, I can make with confidence a diagnosis of autism without having to look at other instrumentation. It's very difficult because there's no blood test or anything to show that somebody has autism or doesn't. Problem comes in, however, when that child gets older and nobody recognized it to may have been autism. Maybe language was just fine. You know, the difference between Asperger's and autism before the recent diagnostic books changed it was that there did not seem to be an impairment with language. Anybody ever watch Sheldon? I have him featured in my next presentation. It's a bit more entertaining than. You know, he certainly fits the criteria from my perspective of somebody with a high-functioning form of autism. But they have the other 2. They have the social impairments and they have the repetitive behaviors when they were a toddler. The brighter you are, the more you're able to imitate. So that's my best friend. So I'm going to imitate everything that she does, and I'm going to look typical. So until there's a surprise. When are there surprises? Surprises come along when, for example, I worked in a deaf school years ago. We taught kids to speech read. And in order for them to understand each other, you had to look at each other. And there's two 11-year-olds walking down the hall, and the boy grabbed her in the shoulder. And she turned around and she smacked him because they just had a lesson about touch. Boys aren't allowed to touch girls. How's he supposed to talk with her if she can't see him? And at any rate, but when there's changes in rules. So adolescence is a time when there's a lot of changes. Part of my criminal justice involvement before was that some of these guys get stuck on things, and they don't recognize that it's not allowed until somebody comes knocking at the door. That's when they're older anyhow. So because of their difficulties of understanding things, I try to get involved in those cases as much as I can. Doctors can make a diagnosis with a child as early as 18 months, and I often do that. I'm one of the ones that can do that, as well as those that are adults. If I base it all upon developmental history, and you come to me and you're 55 years old, do you have information from when you were a toddler? You're certainly not going to remember it. Your brothers and sisters probably are similar age. They're not going to be able to remember it. So unless you have information from parents or from aunts and uncles that knew you fairly well back at that time, otherwise you're forced to use just instrumentation, which to me is a second level of evaluation. Both can be very accurate, but it's really complicated with those that are high functioning because they know what they're supposed to do, even though that's not what they typically do. When you come into a new situation, you don't know the rules for it, and so you kind of just sit there and freeze. It's like my student that didn't know how to start a paper. Once he understood the rules of how to get it started, he flew because he was really bright and could do that, but most can't do that. So by the age of 2, most can actually understand it. Remember, our goal is helping them to enter the kingdom of God. We have a responsibility, those that can talk from the pulpit, to talk about what you do, to talk about what can be possible, to do things with intentionality, to have individuals with any type of a developmental disability or any type of disability act as ushers, act as altar servers, acolytes. One of my students is one of the best lectors at my church. He talks loud, he talks slow, and everybody can understand him, even the people with hearing aids that can never hear me. He drives me crazy because I think he's really boring. But he's extraordinarily good, and everybody loves him because of that reason. He's become very good at that, and he's a bright young man, so he has the ability to do some of these things. But that's with the intentionality. You put him there because he can do something that way, which helps with the socialization as well. That particular child was also very good as he grew up just as a whim. When he was in 3rd grade and I was doing one of these evaluations for him, I said to his parents, as I watched his doodles, I said, he's pretty good. They said, yeah, he is. The art teacher's not working in the summer. Would you consider, this was a Catholic school, would you consider having her work with him, not to change what he's doing, but just to slightly enhance some of the stuff, which is what they did. His graduation party was amazing with the pictures all around the large room that he was in, just how magnificent that's a gift that he had that most people wouldn't have recognized that he could do anything like that, but it was strongly reinforced by his family. So, I'm going to skip the other examples. I've got to do one. Sam and Bill attending Mass. I had a mom come up to me, a second year in the program, and she said, I'd really like to just attend Mass again sometime. My husband doesn't come with me. One boy likes your piano that's down here, and the other one just kind of wanders around. What can I do? And I looked at her and I said, can you give me 12 months? And she kind of shook her head and said, okay. I said, what I'd like you to do for the first 6 weeks is I don't want you to let the boys play, one play the piano before we get started or walk around. But when it comes time to starting Mass, for the first 6 weeks, I want you to just sit in the pew and listen to the first song. After the first song, get up and leave. Okay? For the next 6 weeks, if they've done that successfully, stay for the song, stay for the announcements, the song, and then for the first reading, the Old Testament reading, then get up and leave. I want you to stay for the gospel for 6 weeks more, then get up and leave. Guess where they got stuck? The homily, of course. Some guys are really interesting, some guys are not. Some are short, some are long. It took a long time, so it took more like 18 months, because once we got past the homily, the following spring, the two of them went on together and received the Eucharist and haven't missed since then, because they were able to slowly get accustomed to it. Now here's a deacon, a clergy person, that's telling them, it's okay, just attend the first announcements or the first song of the Mass, and that's okay for your obligation. No priest, right? And good. I shouldn't say it so lightly, because you have to do, is our purpose to prevent sacraments, prevent some of this education, or is it to enhance it and help it? I had a boy that, those hosts sometimes don't really taste very good or don't feel very good. And I had a boy that was, he took it initially, but he didn't like it. He started spitting it. Can you imagine spitting the host if you were in church? It wouldn't work so well. So I gave Mom a bunch we practiced with non-consecrated hosts, so I gave her a bunch to take home, and she came back and said, it's really not working. We did something that was called food chaining. We started to touch his cheek with it, and eventually it got to the point that he kissed it, and eventually he could take a little piece of it. He was taking that, but he still wasn't a happy boy about it. Every time that he would take the Eucharist, he would turn to Mom, and she'd stick a sucker in his mouth, because he wanted a different texture to feel with his tongue afterwards. Again, very pastoral. Please do not do that until you tell your pastor what you're doing, because it's very unusual to introduce food of some sort in with the Eucharist. But again, we're not to prevent sacraments. That's a texture thing. That was a feeling thing that he couldn't basically do, so it was not so good. How do you teach things to these children among each other and to the teenagers who don't really have any college education to be special educators with things like stimming are? I had a kid that I knew from years before that he loved everything that would spin. And so this particular September when we started, it was really hot. Pittsburgh can get hot, but it was really hot then. And our Catholic school, of course, didn't have any type of air conditioning. So we came in, and this boy saw the fan in the corner. So he's walking over towards the fan, and he turns it on, but he turns over to look at me. And I have to go over, and I shut it off, because that kid's from 3 until whatever age. But he sees the fan that's on this side. And he's watching me as I'm turning that one on, and he turns this one on. He's looking at me, and all the people are watching. Meanwhile, I have 25 kids, 25 mentors, 25 sets of parents and their families there, and they're watching this deacon going crazy, chasing this kid because there are 27 fans on the floor. Next week, it was just as hot. The kid came in, he was looking. There wasn't a fan anywhere because the deacon got smart, and he got there early, and he hit everything. You don't know what's self-stimulatory for any particular person, or if you do, you need to anticipate things, which is the biggest thing. I taught my kids my mentors, what stimming was right off the bat with that simple example. I didn't have to use words. They watched me do it, and they could see how he was getting off basically in doing it. He loved it. He loves things that spin. It's understanding what they are. Once I had a teacher come in that was a child that was very impaired. It was actually Henry, the one that does the flapping. His regular teacher from his private school came in to be his teacher here. He went crazy. Guess why? She was in the wrong place. Her place was in the school, not here. What was it going on? Well, as it turns out, I ended up having the youngest sister of 4 that was there, 3 older sisters who were old enough to be mentors. She was actually only 13 or 14 at the time, so they were about the same size. And she would go to the classroom, and they would write on the whiteboard. And when he'd get restless, you could tell she'd take him by the finger. And they'd walk down the long hall to the big plate glass window at the end. She'd blow on the window, and she'd draw lessons there for him until he got restless, and then we'd come back to it. For whatever reason, that was a magic combination. They developed and grew up together as they developed through that type of mentoring. It was really kind of interesting with Henry. Everybody knew that when Henry was in there, that they knew he was part of a triplet. His 2 sisters were mentors of mine. This is one of those stories I told my wife I'd never tell, but I always tell it. After Mass, we were walking down and processing out, and she was starting to approach me from one side, and this woman came and threw her arms around me and started sobbing, just crying. She had just learned that one of her triplets was really significantly impaired with autism, and she said, I'd always hoped that they could receive the sacraments together, and now they can't. And she was inconsolable when Nancy went off the other direction when she saw this woman. And when they received First Communion, all 3 of them did. They all 3 walked on. There wasn't a dry eye in the place because my class was at 8:30. Our Mass that we all attended was 9:30. We kind of took over the center section, and so everybody knew basically everybody because they watched this kid. Now I'll say, did Henry know as much as his sisters about preparation?
Yeah.
He knew it was a holy piece of bread, but he didn't know anything more about it. But that's all that he knew. Let me ask you a question. I had a mentor ask me this one and said, Deacon, this is for you. You're a deacon this time. I looked around earlier, I didn't see a crucifix here, but we're going to pretend there's a crucifix here. If you look at that crucifix, this little second grade boy said, I understand that man up there, that's Jesus. He died on the cross. Okay. Tell me how that this piece of bread can be Jesus, this little non-consecrated host. What would you say to a second grader, any second grader, but then a second grader with autism that needs to see things concretely? I thought I danced pretty good at the time. I told him, I said, Father Richard's going to have a Mass right after this, and there's going to be a miracle that's going to take place on the altar. And it's going to become the body and blood of Jesus, just as Sister talked about. Well, advance up a couple of years to his 8th grade. He's receiving confirmation. Very, very, very bright kid. And he said, you remember that question I asked you? Oh, yeah. Dad's with him. I don't want you to tell me now. Write it down for me. I want you to give me a response back. Comes in the next week. Dad says, will you ask for it? And the essence of it was he still didn't understand how that could be. It wasn't concrete. I can see the moon. I can see with a special telescope, I could probably see Pluto. But I can't see how this could be. So they were stuck. Faith is really complicated. Faith is really hard. If we get stuck on black and white things, why do some of these kids do these things? Why do they, when my kids come up for receiving, how many here are Eucharistic ministers? Many. Did you ever administer Jesus to somebody's nose? You know how you are supposed to bow right beforehand and they forget, and at the very end you're starting to minister and the host goes towards their nose? Not very comforting. But my kids, when they come up, because we practice it so much, they go in, they bow, short bow, simple bow, and then the body of Christ, and then they take it that way. You could always tell, if one looked closely, they're the ones that do it perfectly, because they're going to do it the way we practiced it for the couple of months before they received, and that's the way they always do it, because that's what they're being reinforced for. It's wonderful. We learn from practice. There's also other things that you can learn from practice as well. Thank you. We practice all the rituals. I usually use my mentors as the priest or the Eucharistic minister, or for confirmation as the bishop. It's interesting to have the young girls be bishops, but I think it's cute. We practice receiving the precious blood. I know we can't do that right now, but years ago we could. And so one little, there were second graders, one little kid's looking at it, looks like Kool-Aid, smells like Kool-Aid. He was quick. He didn't realize it wasn't. Took a big swig before I could catch him, and guess what he did? All over the floor. It was a floor like this. It was easy to clean up. It wasn't a big to-do, and it wasn't consecrated. But if he had done that in church again, and had we not practiced, you learn from the things that you practice with. So it's simple, and it's very concrete. Once you get it, somebody asked me once, they were asking about the Holy Spirit, about God, and then, do you ever see God? And there are times in this program when I've seen some of these children walk up to me after a class where it was very successful, and it's like you'll come almost see Jesus' eyes in their eyes. It's focused, they're settled, life is good. It's just there's so many rules that you have to try to anticipate, and every child's different. I did bring a couple of these, and believe it or not, I even have in this version in Spanish. I only brought a few, so if people want some, but it's a labor of love. It's gone on now for 20 years. It's always different. When Pittsburgh consolidated their churches, it made it very difficult, so we had to figure out other methods to do it, but we're still doing it because there's still children with developmental disabilities. Some of them may have CP, some of them may be deaf, some of them may be just, not just, but may have intellectual disabilities, some have Down syndrome. The methods are the same. We're doing it one-to-one, and it seems to be working extraordinarily well, despite the fact that they're teenagers. So I got about a third of the slides, but if I'll ask Father Garcia if he can send you the PowerPoint as well. I'll have a little bit more in the second session, but if there's any questions in the last minute or two that I have. Yes, ma'am.
Question regarding student.
If you're really happy with how the choir's singing a song that you just love, and you keep singing after the music stops, should I have somebody come and stop you? No, it is what it is. They're hurting themselves, yes, if there's something like that. Usually stimming is not a response to anger. It can be. It's usually restlessness. Most of these kids don't know what to do when they're bored. So you have to find things for them to be doing so that they can get it. But it's, the opposite. Stimming's not a symptom of, it's typically not a symptom of somebody that's about to do something that's, even though it may look scary or weird or something, it's, just a way of getting that energy out a little bit. Others? Yes, ma'am.
I think one of the biggest problems, but what we face is what kind of curriculum, how do you modify the curriculum? Do you just say, okay, instead of doing a typical class would do 20, and do you just give them 10? Are there curriculums, you mentioned the Rose Kennedy, how do we do
Yeah.
that? I mean, I'm hoping the diocese, by doing this, is the first big step of, saying, okay, this is what parishes should be doing.
I wrote this originally so any parish could do it by themselves. They all have teenagers. They all need service hours, or many of them do. So it's not so hard to do. The coordinator is the person that goes crazy because you have to get stuff to them. And whatever curriculum you use, I want to get one item. If you look at what goes on in a regular religious education class when it's not a Catholic school, they go to a different classroom with different kids with a teacher that's not a teacher. They're lost in it. How much are you going to accomplish in that period of time? And I'm working one-to-one with somebody that certainly is not a teacher, but they can read a lesson and they can pick one part, and we can talk about it when they need to, and they can administer that lesson. They give it to the homework to the parents so they can practice that lesson in the week that's transpired, and they come back and they reviewed, they do that, they go on to the next lesson. They're getting much, much more, I think, than what they might get in other circumstances, if that makes sense.
So that actually has,
This is the method for it.
okay.
Now, I'll say I'm really naive because when I did this, I assumed that other parishes in my diocese would do it. No. They sent them all their Sutton's program. So they all came to Our Lady of Grace, even from miles away. That's where Michael came from. That's okay with me. I'm not going to turn anybody away. That's why it got to be so large. I know I'm out of time, and I know you're ready for lunch, but I have some books here, and I have time for questions if you'd like. Thank you for your attention today.